Welcome to Rural Farm Tales. If you enjoy rural stories, like and subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. Now, my dear friend Peterson will help us come to today's story.
On the morning of November 14, 1971, in a one-bay repair shop on Route 12 outside of Corydon, Indiana, a man named Hank Jessup leaned over a cracked engine block with a welding torch and lost his eyesight in 4 seconds. He was 44 years old. He had been fixing farm equipment since he was 12. He knew the inside of a tractor engine the way most people know their own kitchen. Every bolt, every gasket, every bearing mapped in his memory like a house he'd built with his own hands. And in 4 seconds, because a fitting on his acetylene tank failed and sent a jet of burning gas across his face, all of that knowledge went dark. The hospital in Louisville told him what he already knew. The corneal damage was total. Both eyes. There would be no surgery, no recovery, no miracle. Hank Jessup, the best independent tractor mechanic in Harrison County, Indiana, was permanently blind. His wife Connie drove him home 3 days later. Hank sat in the passenger seat and listened to the truck tires on the gravel. He could feel the road change from pavement to the county blacktop to the dirt lane that led to their house. He could smell the cattle in the Hendricks pasture and the dead leaves in the ditch and the faint trace of diesel that never quite washed out of his own clothes. He could hear the shop, his shop, as they passed it. The tin roof creaking in the wind, the flag on the pole out front snapping. "Stop the truck," he said. Connie stopped. "Hank, you need to rest," the doctor said. "I need to go inside the shop. Honey, it's dark in there." And she caught herself, closed her eyes for a moment. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "It's always dark now, Connie. Doesn't matter if I rest or don't rest. Take me inside." She led him through the bay door. Hank stood in the middle of the shop floor and breathed in. Oil and metal and cold concrete and the ghost of 1,000 engines that had been torn apart and put back together in this room. His hands found the workbench, found the craftsman toolbox his father had given him in 1948, the year Hank turned 21 and opened the shop. His fingers traced the drawers. Top drawer, wrenches, 1/4 inch to 1 inch, arranged by size. Second drawer, sockets, same arrangement. Third drawer, screwdrivers, pliers, specialty tools. Everything where it had always been. Everything where his hands expected it to be. "I'm going to keep working," he said. Connie didn't argue. She'd been married to Hank for 22 years. She knew that voice. Now let me pause here and tell you something about Hank Jessup before the accident, because the man he was before explains everything about what he did after. Hank grew up on a 120-acre farm outside Corydon. His father, Earl Jessup, farmed with a 1938 Farmall F-20 that broke down so often it became a family joke. Every Saturday, instead of going to town or listening to the radio like other kids, Hank was under that tractor with his father, learning. By the time Hank was 14, he could rebuild a Farmall engine blindfolded. His father used to joke about that, literally blindfolded. Earl would tie a bandana over Hank's eyes and hand him a wrench and say, "Find the head bolt, third from the left," and Hank could do it, every time. "Your hands are smarter than your eyes," Earl told him once. "Eyes can lie. Hands never do. A man who can feel 1,000th of an inch out of true is worth more than a man who can read every gauge in the shop." Hank took that lesson and built a business on it. He opened the shop in 1948 with a craftsman tool set, a hydraulic jack, and a handshake loan from the Corydon Savings Bank, $600 at 4%, paid back in 8 months. By 1960, Hank's shop was the busiest independent repair operation in the county. He worked on everything: Farmalls, John Deere's, Oliver's, Ford's, Alice Chalmers, but his specialty was international harvester equipment. Farmalls specifically. He understood those machines the way a doctor understands a body. He could listen to an engine run for 30 seconds and tell you which valve was sticking, which bearing was wearing, how many hours you had before something expensive broke. The John Deere dealership in Corydon was run by a man named Vern Stucky, 52 years old in 1971, been selling green equipment since Vern and Hank had a complicated relationship. Vern needed Hank because Hank's reputation kept customers honest. If Vern quoted too high on a repair, the farmer would just go to Hank, who'd do it better for less. And Hank needed Vern because the dealership sent overflow work his way when the service bay was backed up. But underneath that arrangement was something else. Vern Stucky believed, with absolute conviction, that independent mechanics were a dying breed. The future was dealership service, factory-trained technicians, computerized diagnostics. The days of a man with a wrench and a good ear were numbered. When Hank lost his eyesight, Vern saw an opportunity. 3 weeks after the accident, Vern drove out to Hank's house, brought a casserole. Connie noted it was store-bought, and sat at the kitchen table with a proposal. "Hank, I'm going to be straight with you. You've had a terrible thing happen. Nobody deserves it. But we both know you can't run that shop anymore. A blind man can't fix tractors. It's not an insult, it's a fact. You can't see what you're working on." Hank sat across the table, his scarred eyes hidden behind dark glasses he'd taken to wearing, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup. "I can feel what I'm working on." "Come on, Hank. Be realistic. What happens when you drop a bolt into the engine? How do you find it? What happens when you need to read a torque spec? How do you check your work? How do you even walk across the shop without tripping over a jack stand?" "I've been in that shop 23 years, Vern. I could walk it in my sleep." "In your sleep isn't the same as blind." Hank's jaw tightened. Connie put her hand on his arm. Vern leaned forward. "Here's what I'm proposing. I'll buy your shop. The building, the tools, the customer list. $15,000. Fair price. You take that money, put it with whatever disability pays, and you and Connie live comfortable. You've earned it." Let me break down those numbers, because this is where you need to understand what Vern was really offering. $15,000 in 1971 was roughly equivalent to a decent annual income. Hank's shop, the building, the land, the equipment, the 2 decades of goodwill was worth at least $30,000, maybe more. Vern wasn't offering a fair price. He was offering a blind man half of what his life's work was worth, knowing the blind man couldn't shop the offer around. "No," Hank said. "Hank, Varkins, no. The shop isn't for sale. I'm going to keep working." Vern shook his head, looked at Connie as if to say, "Talk some sense into him." Connie looked back with an expression that said very clearly, "Get out of my house." Vern left. And on the way back to the dealership, he stopped at the feed store, Mitchell's Feed and Farm Supply, which was the center of every conversation in Harrison County, and he told Dale Mitchell and whoever else was listening exactly what had happened. "The man's lost his mind along with his eyes. Says he's going to keep fixing tractors. Blind. Can't see a wrench in front of his face. But he's going to fix tractors. I give it a month before someone gets hurt and he gets sued and that shop closes for good." That story traveled through the county in 48 hours. By the weekend, everybody had an opinion about the blind mechanic on Route 12 who thought he could still fix tractors. Most of the opinions weren't kind. Now here's what nobody saw. Here's what happened inside that shop in the 6 weeks between the accident and the day Hank took his first paying job as a blind mechanic. Hank reorganized everything. Every tool, every part, every bin, every shelf. He built a system based on touch and position. Wrenches hung on pegboard in exact sequence. He could reach without looking and grab the 11/16 because it was always third from the left on the second row. Bolts and nuts sorted into coffee cans by size, each can with a different number of notches cut into the rim so he could feel which was which. Floor paths cleared and memorized. Jack stand positions standardized. Connie helped. She painted bright yellow stripes on the floor, not for Hank but for customers, so they'd walk on the paths and not leave things where Hank might trip. She organized the parts catalogs into a system where Hank would describe what he needed, and she'd find the part number and place the order. She became his eyes for paperwork. His hands remained his own. The first job came in December 9th. Willis Crawford, who farmed 200 acres east of town, had a 1964 Farmall 504 with a hydraulic leak. Willis had taken it to Vern's dealership first. Vern quoted $340 for the repair, new hydraulic pump, labor, fluids. Willis couldn't afford $340, so he drove the tractor to Hank's shop, half out of desperation and half out of loyalty. Willis had been bringing his equipment to Hank for 15 years.
Hank, I know about your situation. If you can't do it, I understand, but Vern wants $340 and I just don't have it.
Drive it into the bay, Willis. Willis drove the farm all in. Hank walked to the tractor, put his hands on the hydraulic housing, and listened. He had Willis raise and lower the three-point hitch, while Hank held his palm against different parts of the system, feeling for the vibration that would tell him where the pressure was escaping. Took him 4 minutes. It's not the pump, Willis. It's the O-ring on the control valve. Vern wanted to sell you a whole new pump because he doesn't have a man in his shop who can feel the difference between a blown O-ring and a bad pump. I can feel it. The pulse is wrong, too fast, too shallow. That's a seal, not a pump. He replaced the O-ring in 40 minutes. Charged Willis $18, $3 for the part, $15 for labor. Willis drove out of that shop and went straight to Mitchell's feed store and told every man at the counter what had just happened. The blind mechanic had diagnosed a hydraulic problem by touch in 4 minutes that the JD dealership had misdiagnosed for $340. That story traveled faster than Vern Stucky's story had. Fast forward to 1970, 3 years after the accident. Hank's shop was busier than it had ever been when he could see, not despite his blindness, in a strange way because of it. Here's why. When Hank could see, he diagnosed problems the way every mechanic did, visually. Look for the leak. Look for the crack. Look for the wear. But when his eyes stopped working, he'd been forced to develop something else. He diagnosed by sound, by vibration, by temperature, by smell. He could put his hand on a running engine and feel a bearing going bad 300 hours before it would fail. He could hear a valve adjustment that was 1/1000th of an inch off. He could smell an electrical problem, the faint ozone of an arcing wire, before it burned anything. Farmers started calling it Hank's magic. It wasn't magic, it was 23 years of experience channeled through hands that had no choice but to become extraordinary. But here's the part of the story that matters most. Here's the part that turned a local curiosity into a county legend. If you've been watching this channel, you know what was coming in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The worst farm crisis since the Great Depression. Interest rates hit the high teens. Land values collapsed. Corn and soybean prices fell below the cost of production. And farmers who had borrowed to buy new equipment found themselves owing more than their farms were worth. Between 1979 and 1986, 14 farms in Harrison County went to auction. 14 families who had been on their land for generations lost everything. And every single one of those families had something in common. They were carrying debt on equipment they'd bought from Vern Stucky's dealership. Now, I want to be fair. Vern didn't cause the crisis. The crisis was national, global, even. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to kill inflation, and farm country paid the price. But Vern had spent 20 years telling farmers that new equipment was the answer to everything. Finance a new 4430. Trade in that old Farmall. Bigger is better. Modern is smarter. Debt is just the cost of doing business. And when the crisis hit, those farmers couldn't make their payments. The tractors got repossessed. The farms went to auction. And Vern's dealership, which had been fat and profitable in the boom years, started dying too. Because who buys new tractors when the whole county is going broke? By 1982, Vern had laid off 3 of his 4 service technicians. His parts department was a ghost town. New tractor sales had dropped to nearly zero. The only revenue keeping the doors open was used equipment sales, and whatever warranty service was still trickling in. And across town, on Route 12, Hank Jessup's one-bay shop had a waiting list. Let me tell you why. Because this is the lesson at the heart of this story, and it's a lesson about value that goes beyond tractors and farms. When times are good, people buy new things. They finance, they upgrade, they replace. When times are bad, people fix what they have. And when people need to fix what they have, they go to the man who understands old equipment better than anyone alive. They go to the man who can make a 1956 Farmall 400 run for another 10 years with a $40 part and 4 hours of work instead of replacing it with a $40,000 tractor and a 7-year loan. They go to Hank. But Hank did something Vern never would have done. Something that turned customers into family. Hank didn't charge what the work was worth. He charged what the farmer could afford. If a man came in with a broken transmission and $200 to his name, Hank fixed the transmission for $200. If a widow came in with a dead tractor and nothing in her checking account, Hank fixed it and told her to pay when she could. He kept a ledger, a notebook Connie read to him each month. And over the course of the crisis years, Hank extended roughly $12,000 in free or reduced price labor to farmers who couldn't pay. Every single one of them paid him back. Every one. Some took months, some took years, but they all paid because Hank had given them something Vern's dealership never had: dignity. He'd treated them like neighbors, not customers, like people, not accounts receivable. And here's the curiosity you've been waiting for. Here's the thing about Vern Stucky that nobody in the county knew until Vern had been losing customers to Hank for years. At first he'd dismissed it, then he'd been annoyed by it, then quietly he'd started doing something about it. In 1978, Vern hired a young mechanic named Tommy Baldridge. Bright kid, good with tools, eager to learn. Vern gave Tommy a specific assignment: figure out how Hank was diagnosing problems so fast. Go to the shop, get a repair done. Watch, listen, learn whatever trick the blind man was using, and bring it back to the dealership. Tommy went. He brought in a Farmall 706 with a mysterious engine knock. Told Hank he'd just bought it at auction and couldn't figure out what was wrong. Hank put his hands on the engine, listened, had Tommy rev it, then let it idle, then rev it again. Then Hank walked to the right side of the engine, placed his palm on the valve cover, and held it there for 30 seconds. "Number 3 exhaust valve," Hank said. "Seat's burned. You can feel it in the cover. There's a vibration pattern that's different from the others, like a heartbeat that skips. Hear it?" Tommy couldn't hear it, couldn't feel it, had no idea what Hank was talking about. "Mr. Jessup, how do you know it's number 3 and not number 4 or 5? Hank smiled. It was the first genuine smile Tommy had seen on the blind man's face. "Because I've felt every valve on every farm, all built between 1939 and 1971. My hands know what right feels like. When something's wrong, it feels different, like reading Braille, except the language is engines." Tommy went back to the dealership and told Vern what he'd seen. Vern's response was immediate. "That's not a trick. That's 30 years of experience we can't replicate. Forget it. Just push the new equipment harder." But Tommy didn't forget it. Tommy Baldridge went back to Hank's shop the next week, and the week after that. Not as a spy anymore. As a student. He'd come after hours, help Hank clean up and ask questions. How do you find a bearing going bad? What does a scored cylinder wall feel like? How can you tell the difference between a timing issue and a fuel issue just by listening? Hank taught him everything. Not because he didn't know Tommy worked for Vern. He knew. He'd known from the first visit. Connie had recognized Tommy's truck and told Hank exactly who had sent him. "Why are you teaching me if you know I work for Vern?" Tommy asked one evening. "Because you want to learn. That's enough reason. And because Vern's going to need good mechanics when his dealership starts hurting. I'd rather the farmers in this county have someone who knows what he's doing, even if he works for a man I don't much care for." That was Hank. Fix the thing in front of you. Help the person who needs it. Don't worry about who gets the credit. Now I need to tell you what happened in the winter of 1983, because that's when everything changed. January 14th, 1983. Temperature was 8 degrees. Hank was in his shop working on Amos Davenport's farm, all 806, a big tractor with a big problem. The torque amplifier was failing, which meant the transmission was essentially dying. A rebuilt TA from the dealership cost $1,800 parts and labor. Amos didn't have Hank had pulled the TA and was rebuilding it himself, replacing the clutch plates, the thrust washers, the bearings, when he heard a truck pull into the lot, heard the door slam, heard footsteps on the concrete, heard breathing that was wrong. Not exertion wrong, emotion wrong. "Who's there?" Hank said, hands still inside the transmission. "It's Vern." Hank didn't move, didn't take his hands out of the TA. "Come in, Vern. Mind the yellow lines on the floor." Vern Stucky walked into Hank's shop for the first time in 12 years. He stood in the bay and looked around, looked at the organized tools, the coffee can parts system, the yellow floor paths, the blind mechanic with his arms elbow deep in a transmission. "I need help, Hank." "What kind of help?" "The kind I don't deserve to ask for." Hank pulled his hands out, wiped them on a rag, turned toward Vern's voice, the dark glasses reflecting the shop lights. "Sit down, Vern. There's a stool behind you, 3 steps back and 1 to the left." Vern found the stool, sat down, and then Vern Stucky, who had told the whole county that a blind man couldn't fix tractors, who had offered to buy Hank's shop for half its value, who had sent a spy to steal Hank's methods, Vern Stucky told Hank the truth. The dealership was dying. New sales were 0. Used sales were slow. The service bay was empty because Vern had fired everyone except Tommy Baldridge, and Tommy couldn't handle the volume alone. Vern owed the bank $94,000 on the building and inventory. His wife had left him in October. He was 3 months behind on his mortgage. "I've been a horse's ass to you, Hank. I know it. You know it. The whole county knows it. I told everyone you were finished when you lost your eyes. I tried to buy your shop for nothing. I sent Tommy to spy on you, and the whole time, you just kept working. You just kept fixing tractors and helping people and being better at this than I ever was." Hank listened without expression. "What do you want, Vern?" "I want to send you my overflow. The work Tommy can't handle. Warranty stuff I'm contractually obligated to do but can't staff. I'll pay you dealership rates, $45 an hour. I charge $20. I know you do. And that's why farmers drive past my shop to get to yours. I'll charge you $22. Vern was quiet for a moment. "You'd help me? After everything?" "I'm not helping you, Vern. I'm helping the farmers who need their equipment fixed. You just happen to be involved." There was a sound, and this detail came from Connie, who was in the office and heard every word. A sound that might have been Vern Stucky clearing his throat, or might have been something else entirely. "Thank you, Hank. Don't thank me. Send me the work. And tell Tommy to stop by this weekend. I want to show him how to adjust a torque amplifier without pulling the whole thing. Save him 4 hours on every one." Vern left, and from that day on, for the next 5 years, Hank Jessup quietly kept Vern Stucky's dealership alive by handling the overflow work that Vern couldn't do himself. Hank never told anyone about the arrangement. Vern never advertised it. The farmers who brought their equipment to the dealership and got it back fixed right and fixed fast never knew that half the work had been done by the blind mechanic on Route 12. But people figured it out. They always do. Because farmers talk. And eventually someone noticed that the quality of work coming out of Vern's shop had improved dramatically around the same time Vern stopped bad-mouthing Hank Jessup. By 1986, the crisis was easing. Not over. It wouldn't truly be over until the end of the decade, but the worst had passed. Land prices had stabilized. Interest rates had come down. The farmers who survived, the ones who hadn't borrowed too much, who hadn't expanded too fast, who had fixed their old equipment instead of financing new, those farmers were still standing, and almost all of them had, at some point in those terrible years, brought a tractor to Hank's shop. Connie kept count. Between 1979 and 1987, Hank repaired equipment for 147 different farmers. He rebuilt 43 transmissions, 67 hydraulic systems, 22 engines, and more individual components than Connie could track. His average charge during the crisis years was $14 an hour, $6 below his already low posted rate, because he adjusted for what people could pay. If he charged dealership rates, he would have earned roughly $220,000 in that period. What he actually earned was about $95,000. The difference, $125,000 in work he did at cost or for free, was his contribution to keeping Harrison County's farms alive. He never called it a contribution. He called it work. In 1988, the Indiana Farm Bureau invited Hank to receive their Distinguished Service Award at the annual meeting in Indianapolis. Hank didn't want to go. Connie made him. He stood on a stage in front of 400 farmers, a blind man in clean coveralls with his dark glasses and his calloused hands, and he said this: "I've been asked to talk about what I did during the crisis. I fixed tractors. That's what I do. I fixed them before the crisis, and I fixed them during the crisis, and I'll fix them after the crisis until my hands don't work anymore." People make a big deal about the blind part. I don't. My eyes stopped working in everything else kept working. My hands, my ears, my memory, the things that actually fix tractors, never needed eyes in the first place. He paused. The room was silent. The John Deere dealer told me I was finished when I lost my sight. Said a blind man can't fix tractors. He was wrong about that, but I'll tell you what he was right about. A blind man can't see what's coming. I didn't see the crisis coming. Nobody did. But here's what I learned. You don't need to see what's coming if you're already prepared for it. I was prepared because I had no debt, low overhead, and 30 years of experience in my hands. That's all the preparation anyone needs. He got a standing ovation. 400 farmers on their feet, applauding a blind man who had kept their county alive by doing the only thing he knew how to do. Vern Stucky was in the audience, third row. He stood and applauded with everyone else. And after the ceremony, he went to Hank and said something that nobody else heard. Connie was there, standing next to Hank, and she told me what Vern said. "Hank, 12 years ago I told Dale Mitchell that you were finished, that you'd lost your mind along with your eyes. I need you to know that I was the biggest fool in Harrison County that day, not because I was wrong about you, although I was, but because I was wrong about everything, about new equipment being better, about debt being normal, about dealerships being the future and independent shops being the past. You were the future, Hank. A man in a one-bay shop with a set of good tools and the will to help people. That's been the future all along. I just couldn't see it." He paused. Then he smiled. "And I'm the one with eyes." Hank laughed. It was the first time Vern had ever heard him laugh. Tommy Baldridge took over Vern's dealership in 1992 when Vern retired. The first thing Tommy did was put a sign in the service bay. It said, "Before you replace it, call Hank," with Hank's phone number underneath. Tommy ran that dealership for 23 years. He never once pushed a farmer into a loan they couldn't afford. He never once recommended replacing equipment that could be repaired. And every single one of his service technicians, every one, spent their first month on the job at Hank's shop on Route 12, learning to diagnose by touch and sound before they ever picked up a diagnostic computer. "The computer tells you what's wrong," Tommy would tell them. "Hank's method tells you why. If you understand why, you can fix anything." Hank Jessup worked in his shop until 2004. He was 77 years old. His hands finally gave out, arthritis, the mechanic's curse. He closed the shop on a Friday afternoon in October, locked the door, and stood in the parking lot, listening to the traffic on Route 12 and the wind in the trees and the distant sound of a tractor working a field somewhere to the south. Connie drove him home. On the way, Hank said, "I fixed my last tractor today. How does that feel?" He thought about it. "Like I did enough." Hank died in 1972, heart attack in his sleep. The funeral was at the Baptist church in Corydon. The parking lot wasn't big enough. They had to park in the field across the road. 200 trucks and cars, lined up in rows like equipment at a farm show. Tommy Baldridge gave the eulogy. He told the story of being sent to spy on Hank He told the story of Hank teaching him anyway. He told the story of the day Vern came to Hank's shop in the winter of 1983 and asked for help, and Hank helped, because that's what Hank did. Then Tommy said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. Hank Jessup lost his sight in 1971 and never lost a single customer. Think about that. A blind mechanic in a one-bay shop kept every customer he had and gained hundreds more. Not because he was cheap, although he was affordable. Not because he was fast, although he was efficient. But because he was honest. He only fixed what needed fixing. He only charged what was fair. And he treated every farmer who walked through his door like a neighbor who needed help, not a customer who owed money. Tommy looked out at the congregation. 200 people. Farmers, mechanics, dealers, bankers, the county judge, the feed store owner. 3 generations of families who had brought their equipment to Route 12. The JD dealer said a blind man can't fix tractors. Hank proved him wrong. But here's the thing. Hank didn't prove him wrong to make a point. He proved him wrong because he had work to do. There were tractors that needed fixing, people who needed help, and the fact that he couldn't see didn't change any of that. Hank used to say something I'll never forget. He said, "Most people look at a broken tractor and see a problem. I put my hands on it and feel a question. The tractor is asking me what's wrong. My job is to listen." That's what made him great. Not his blindness, not his hands, his willingness to listen. The shop on Route 12 still stands. It's a storage building now. Tommy bought it from Connie after Hank's death and uses it to store parts. But the pegboard is still there with the wrench outlines. The coffee cans are still on the shelves, each one with notches cut in the rim. The yellow stripes are still on the floor, faded but visible. And on the wall above the workbench there's a framed photograph. Hank and Connie, taken in 1988 at the Indiana Farm Bureau Awards ceremony. Hank is holding the Distinguished Service plaque. He's facing the camera but not looking at it, because he couldn't. He's smiling, though. A real smile. The kind of smile that comes from knowing you did enough. Next to the photograph is a small brass plate. Tommy had it engraved after the funeral. It says, Hank Jessup, 1927-2009. He fixed what was broken. He didn't need eyes to see what mattered. Sometimes the most valuable man in the county is the one everybody counted out. Sometimes the most honest shop is the one-bay garage on a back road. Sometimes the man who can't see is the only one who truly understands what he's looking at. Hank Jessup lost his eyes and found something better, the trust of every farmer in Harrison County. And that trust, like a well-maintained farm-all engine, never broke down. Not once, not ever.